What if the most dangerous weapon Iran had left in this entire war just got taken away in the last 72 hours? For months, Iran believed it held the one card that could bring a superpower to its knees. That card is now gone, and almost nobody is talking about how it happened. Before we get into this, if you want to actually understand what is happening in the Middle East right now, instead of just seeing scary headlines with no context, do one simple thing for me. Tap that subscribe button, hit like on this video, and send it to one person who keeps asking you, what is going on with oil prices? That single share helps this channel more than you know, and it takes you 5 seconds. Now let's get into it. It is August 2026, and the Strait of Hormuz has become the most contested strip of water on the planet. This is not some faraway conflict that has nothing to do with you. Every time you fill up your car, every time a package shows up at your door, every time a factory somewhere makes the parts that go into your phone, this waterway is quietly involved. About a quarter of the world's oil and a fifth of its liquefied natural gas used to pass through this narrow channel every single day. Iran knew that, and Iran tried to use it as a weapon. To understand how we got here, we need to rewind to the end of February this year. The United States and Israel launched a coordinated strike against Iran, hitting military sites, government targets, and killing Iran's supreme leader along with several top officials. It was a shock to the entire region. Iran did not sit back and absorb it quietly. It fired missiles and drones at Israel, at American bases, and at countries allied with the United States across the Middle East. And in the same breath, Iran did something that sent a much bigger message than any missile could. It shut down the Strait of Hormuz. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps sent out warnings on open radio channels telling every ship in the area that no vessel was allowed to pass. They boarded merchant ships, they attacked commercial vessels, and most dangerously, they began scattering sea mines across the strait. Shipping companies panicked. Insurance. Costs for tankers exploded overnight. Some firms simply refused to send their ships anywhere near the region. For a country that could not match the United States plane for plane or ship for ship, this was Iran's version of leverage. Choke the world's energy supply and the world will come begging for a deal on your terms. For a while, it actually looked like it might work. In mid-June, Iran and the United States sat down and signed an agreement. President Trump and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian put their names on a memorandum that promised something huge. The naval blockade the U.S. had placed on Iran would be lifted. In exchange, Iran promised 60 days of free and safe passage for commercial ships through the strait, while the long-term question of who actually manages Hormuz would be worked out later with Oman and the Gulf states. Markets breathed a sigh of relief. Oil prices came down. For about a month, it felt like the worst might be behind us. Then, right on schedule, that fragile peace started cracking. By the middle of July, Iran had gone back to attacking commercial vessels. Several Arab states got hit directly, and the United States did not hesitate. Within days, the naval blockade against Iran was back in full force, tighter than before. Here is where the story gets interesting. Because what happened next is not what Iran expected at all. Since that blockade was reimposed, U.S. Central Command has been releasing near-daily updates, and the numbers tell a brutal story. Dozens of commercial vessels trying to move in or out of Iranian ports have been redirected. Some ships have been disabled outright. Others have been boarded and searched, including a tanker flying under a foreign flag that became something of a symbol for what happens when someone tries to slip cargo through under the radar. On one recent day, only a handful of ships managed to cross the strait. In an entire week, fewer than 30 vessels made the crossing. Compare that to the normal flow of a waterway that used to carry a quarter of the planet's oil, and you start to understand just how completely that channel has been strangled. Iran built its entire strategy around the idea that closing Hormuz would be its trump card. Instead, it turned into a trap that is closing around Iran's own economy. Every single day this blockade continues, Iran is estimated to be losing somewhere around $500 million in oil revenue. Sit with that number for a second. $500 million gone every 24 hours because a plan that looked clever on paper collapsed the moment it met reality. And remember, this is a country already dealing with a leadership vacuum after losing its top officials earlier in the year, already strained by years of sanctions, and now watching its own economy bleed out because of a blockade it triggered against itself. So it should not surprise you that Iran's public tone has completely flipped over the last couple of weeks. The same government that once vowed the strait would stay shut is now sending negotiators to sit down with Oman to work out a joint plan for managing shipping traffic going forward. Iranian officials have said publicly that talks with Oman are close to a framework. Even President Trump has said a deal could come within days. Reports out of Qatar suggest draft agreements are already circulating and moving through what officials call very progressive stages. But do not think for a second that this transition has been smooth or that everyone inside Iran agrees on backing down. Just this week, A senior military advisor to Iran's supreme leader went on state television and made a threat that should tell you everything about how desperate this posture has become. He said Iran will not stand by and allow the naval blockade to continue. He said no shipping route through Hormuz would be allowed except the one Iran controls. And then he said something remarkable. He warned that if American warships enter what he called the illegal route through the strait, Iran will target them directly. Think about how strange that threat actually is. This is coming from a country whose mine-laying fleet has already been sent to the bottom of the Persian Gulf. It is like a boxer whose entire team just got knocked out cold, still standing in the corner shouting that he is about to win the next round. At some point, you have to look at the actual scoreboard. So let's look at it. Before I go further, I want to ask you something. If this kind of breakdown, the kind that actually explains why something is happening instead of just repeating a scary headline, is valuable to you, do me a favor and comment one word below telling me where you're watching this from today. It genuinely helps me understand who is watching, and it helps this video reach more people who need this kind of context instead of noise. Now, back to the story. Iran's entire plan for holding Hormuz hostage was built around speed and cheapness. Dozens of small, fast boats loaded with sea mines, scattering them across the strait. On paper, this is smart, asymmetric warfare. You do not need a real navy to threaten the most important waterway on Earth. You just need cheap boats, some mines, and the will to use them. Laying a mine is far easier than finding and removing one. You can push these things off the back of a small boat with barely any training. For a while, this tactic worked frighteningly well. Shipping traffic through Hormuz collapsed. Insurance premiums for tankers spiked to levels nobody had seen before. Entire fleets started rerouting around the southern tip of Africa just to avoid the strait completely, adding weeks to shipping times and driving up the cost of everything from gasoline at your local pump to basic goods on store shelves. Then, the United States Navy did exactly what a global superpower does when someone tries to hold the world economy hostage with a fleet of speedboats. It found them, and it sank them. Central Command confirmed striking more than a dozen Iranian mine-laying vessels in an initial wave near the strait. President Trump publicly claimed that nearly all of Iran's mine-dropping boats were now sitting on the ocean floor. Whether the exact number was precisely confirmed or not almost does not matter, because what nobody disputes is that Iran's ability to lay new mines was gutted almost overnight. And then came the order that changed everything going forward. Trump directed the Navy to shoot on sight any vessel caught laying mines in the strait. No warning shots, no hesitation. Combine that standing order with a fleet that has already lost nearly all of its mine-laying capacity, and you get exactly what we are seeing right now. A regime that physically cannot rebuild the kind of threat it needs to keep this leverage alive. But here's something people often miss. Sinking the boats does not make the mines that are already sitting on the ocean floor disappear. This is where the far less glamorous, far more dangerous work of the U.S. Navy's mine-clearing teams comes in, and honestly, it is one of the most fascinating parts of this entire operation. These are not the classic spiked balls floating on the surface that you picture from old war movies. Most of what Iran laid sits on the seabed or hangs just beneath the surface, and can be triggered either by the pressure change of a ship passing overhead, or by picking up the sound signature of an engine. Finding something like that takes real patience. It is slow. It is methodical, and it is genuinely dangerous. First comes mine hunting, using high-resolution sonar to actually locate mines resting near the seabed. Then comes mine sweeping, using mechanical or magnetic systems to trigger those mines safely from a distance, instead of physically running into them. The Navy had actually reduced its number of dedicated mine sweeping ships in recent years, but it adapted by using combat vessels equipped with mine warfare systems, towed sonar arrays, and artificial intelligence that scans sonar data and flags likely mine contacts far faster than any human eye staring at a screen ever could. This is what naval warfare looks like in 2026. It is not just steel and firepower anymore. It is algorithms sorting through noise under the water to find a 200-pound explosive hiding in the dark. Once mines are found and neutralized, that is the moment a strait can genuinely be called clear. Not just quiet on the surface, but physically safe for a fully loaded oil tanker to pass without the risk of being blown apart. And the crews doing this work are taking on a kind of risk most of us never think about. You are not chasing a target you can see from miles away on radar. You are crawling forward at a crawl through water you know, for a fact, hides live explosives, trusting sonar readings and AI-flagged contacts to tell you where not to go. One missed signal, one mine that slips past detection, and you are looking at a catastrophic loss right there in the water. Every day this operation runs without an incident says a lot about how good these crews and this technology actually are. That is part of why none of this has moved as fast as headlines might suggest. Nobody in the Navy is going to rush a mine-clearing mission just to hit a political deadline, because cutting corners here does not just risk a delay. It risks turning a diplomatic breakthrough into a humanitarian disaster with a single tanker explosion. So while politicians go back and forth in public about timelines, the actual work happening on the water has stayed careful and deliberate the entire time. That discipline is exactly why we have not seen a single mine strike a commercial vessel since this clearing phase began, and that overlap matters. The mine clearing operation has been running at the same time as the diplomatic talks, which makes complete sense once you think about it from Washington's side. You do not want to sign an agreement to reopen Hormuz and then watch the very first tanker that uses it get blown apart because the sweep was not finished. So while hardliners in Tehran make threats on state television, and while negotiators in Muscat hammer out the legal framework for how shipping should work going forward, U.S. naval assets are quietly doing the unglamorous, highly technical job of making sure the water underneath all of that political noise is actually safe. Central Command has continued insisting throughout all of this that the strait remains open and that U.S. forces are still operating there, directly contradicting hardliners in Tehran who claim otherwise. And honestly, the fact that oil prices have not spiraled into total chaos tells you which version of events the market actually believes. Brent crude has been hovering in a range that, while elevated, is nowhere close to the peak seen when the strait was fully shut and prices were spiking far higher. A market with real hope of a resolution behaves very differently than a market bracing for a closed waterway indefinitely. Now let's zoom out for a second and really understand why this single strip of water matters so much. The Strait of Hormuz is only about 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, and the actual shipping lanes tankers use are even tighter than that. There is no realistic alternative that can absorb that kind of volume overnight. Yes, some cargo has been rerouted around the southern tip of Africa, but that adds 2 to 3 extra weeks of travel time and millions of dollars in fuel costs per voyage. Some volume has been pushed through pipelines that bypass the strait entirely, and Saudi Arabia has actually converted some of its gas liquid pipeline capacity into crude oil service, pushing output on one major pipeline to a record level far beyond what it was originally built to handle. But even with all of that creative maneuvering, nothing comes close to replacing what normally flows through Hormuz on an ordinary day. So when Iran threatened to shut this down, it was not threatening a regional inconvenience. It was threatening to put a chokehold on the global economy itself. And that is exactly why the response from Washington had to be this aggressive. You cannot let one regional power hold that kind of leverage over the entire planet's energy supply and let it sit unanswered. It also helps to understand why this particular strait, out of all the water on Earth, became the flashpoint for this entire war. Hormuz is not just narrow, it is also the only sea route in or out of the Persian Gulf for several major oil-producing nations, not just Iran. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and Qatar all depend on this same channel to move their own exports to the rest of the world. That is part of what made Iran's gamble so risky from the start. Closing Hormuz was never going to hurt only the United States or its allies. It was always going to hurt Iran's own neighbors just as badly, countries Iran still needs some level of working relationship with, even amid all this hostility. And when a strategy starts damaging the very neighbors you might eventually need on your side, that strategy has a built-in expiration date. It might take a few weeks to show up in the numbers. It might take a few months, but it always shows up eventually, and it has clearly shown up now. There's also a human layer to this that gets lost in talk of barrels and percentages. Every tanker that gets rerouted around Africa instead of through Hormuz means higher shipping costs, and higher shipping costs eventually land somewhere. They land in the price of gasoline at a pump thousands of miles away from this conflict. They land in the cost of goods sitting on a shelf in a store that has nothing to do with the Middle East. Ordinary people who have never heard of Bab el-Mandeb or the Strait of Hormuz still feel the ripple effects of this fight every time they check their bank account. That is exactly why a regional standoff over a narrow strip of water can dominate global headlines the way this one has. It is never really just regional. It never was. If you've made it this far, you clearly care about understanding this properly, not just watching a clip and moving on. So here's my ask. Hit that like button right now before you forget. Because it genuinely tells this platform to show this kind of long-form breakdown to more people instead of 30-second sound bites that leave out everything that actually matters. It takes 1 second. Let's keep going. Just this week, on August 8th, Iran's national security chief laid out a public list of demands that Iran wants met before it will agree to reopen the strait for good. Iran is calling for the naval blockade to be fully lifted, for U.S. military forces to be withdrawn from the region, and for the war itself to be permanently declared over. On top of that, Iran wants compensation for the damage caused during the conflict, and it wants its frozen assets released. The statement framed these as demands of the Iranian people after months of what officials called steadfast resistance. Until, in their words, America corrects its behavior, the strait will not reopen. It is a bold statement to make from a country that is losing $500 million a day and watching its own mine-laying navy sitting at the bottom of the Persian Gulf. But it also tells you something important. Even as Iran negotiates with Oman on the technical details of managing shipping traffic, the political leadership is still trying to extract something bigger out of this moment before they let go of their only remaining piece of leverage entirely. So why did Iran actually blink? I do not think it was one single blow. I think it was death by 1,000 cuts, and each cut on its own might not have been enough, but stacked together, they broke the entire strategy. First, the military cut. The loss of the mine-laying fleet combined with a standing shoot on site order that makes rebuilding that fleet essentially a suicide mission for any crew that tries it. Second, the economic cut. That $500 million daily bleed that does not care about ideology or revolutionary speeches. It just keeps draining the treasury every single day the blockade holds. Third, the diplomatic cut. Oman, stepping in as the one broker both sides still trust enough to sit across the table from. Oman has quietly been the adult in the room this entire conflict, carrying messages, hosting talks, and its credibility as a neutral party might be one of the most valuable assets left in the entire region right now. Fourth, the regional cut. Iran's own neighbors, the same Gulf states expected to be part of any future management of the strait, are furious about the economic damage this crisis has caused them too. Iran simply cannot afford to alienate every country around it while also trying to survive a direct conflict with the United States. Add all of that together, and the blockade Iran built to be its trump card became the exact mechanism that dragged it back to the negotiating table, weaker than when it started. That is the real headline underneath all of this. It is not just that the United States military physically broke the blockade by sinking boats and clearing mines. It is that Iran's entire strategic bet, the belief that it could hold the global energy market hostage and use that as leverage against a superpower, has now completely collapsed. And every other actor around the world watching this unfold, anyone considering similar tactics against the United States or its allies, just watched a very expensive lesson play out in real time. Now here is where this story connects to something happening right now in a completely different body of water, and it matters more than most people realize. While all of this has been unfolding in Hormuz, the conflict has widened to include the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the choke point at the base of the Red Sea. Iran-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen have been threatening to disrupt shipping through that corridor too. And this creates a uniquely painful problem for Saudi Arabia specifically. When Hormuz got choked off, Saudi Arabia had to reroute a huge portion of its oil exports through the Red Sea instead, treating Bab el-Mandeb as its emergency backup route to keep crude flowing to global markets. Now the Houthis are targeting that route as well. In July, the Houthis announced they were closing that waterway entirely to Saudi-linked shipping. And just this past week, they escalated further, claiming responsibility for firing missiles at a Saudi oil tanker near a port city in the northern Red Sea. Around the same time, maritime authorities reported a separate explosion near another tanker further south, and just days before that, an Indian-flagged vessel was reportedly struck and sunk off the coast of Yemen. This is not a coincidence. It is not random escalation. If you are Iran and your primary leverage point at Hormuz is collapsing because your mine-laying fleet got sunk and your economy is bleeding $500 million a day, what do? You lean harder on your other proxy. You open a second front that keeps pressure on the exact same target, which is Gulf oil exports, just through a different waterway, without risking your own navy directly. It is the same playbook Iran has leaned on throughout this entire war. When the direct fight is not working, shift the pressure onto proxies, shift the geography, try to make operating in the region so painful and expensive that anybody decides it is not worth it anymore. The problem for Iran is that this backup plan requires its proxy network to actually hold together and deliver real results, and Houthi attacks on an already reduced flow of Saudi exports through the Red Sea simply do not carry the same weight as choking off a quarter of the world's oil supply through Hormuz. It is a consolation prize, dressed up as a strategy. Saudi Arabia is not sitting back and absorbing these hits either. Missile defense batteries positioned along the Saudi coast have been intercepting a large share of inbound missiles and drones on a near-weekly basis. Every successful intercept never makes headlines because nothing happened. Every failed intercept becomes international news within hours. That imbalance makes it easy to forget just how many of these attacks are actually being stopped before they reach anything close to their target. Put all of these pieces together, and you can see the real pattern underneath this entire story. Iran built its wartime strategy around choke points, Hormuz first, because it was the biggest lever available, the one capable of genuinely rattling the global economy and forcing a superpower to negotiate on Iran's terms. When that started failing, because the United States systematically dismantled the mine-laying capability and backed it with a shoot on site order, Iran did not abandon the choke point strategy entirely. It simply shifted the weight of that strategy onto a second choke point further south, using a proxy force instead of its own navy to keep the pressure alive. That is not desperation dressed as randomness. That is a regime working through its available levers, one at a time, as each previous lever gets taken away. And here is the honest red on where that leaves Iran. Every layer of this strategy requires either physical assets that can be found and destroyed, or a proxy network that can be squeezed through diplomatic and military pressure aimed at its sponsor. Mines require boats, and boats can be sunk. Missiles fired from Yemen require launch sites and supply chains that trace directly back to Tehran, and that supply chain has already been targeted repeatedly throughout this war. So what Iran is really doing right now is buying time. It is stretching out the appearance of leverage for as long as it possibly can, while the actual substance underneath that leverage keeps eroding, piece by piece, day after day. That $500 million daily drain does not pause because the Houthis fired a missile into the Red Sea. It just keeps compounding. And the moment Oman and Iran finalize a joint mechanism for Hormuz, which by every indication is close, Iran will lose its single biggest bargaining chip in this entire war. Left negotiating from a Red Sea proxy position that is fundamentally weaker than the position it just gave up. There's a bigger lesson here too, one that stretches far beyond this one conflict. For years, asymmetric blockade strategies against global choke points were treated almost like a great equalizer. This idea that a country without a real navy could still hold global trade hostage using cheap, disposable tactics. What just happened in Hormuz is a live case study in the limits of that idea. When the country on the other end has the intelligence to locate every asset involved, the firepower to remove it without hesitation, and the economic staying power to simply outlast the other side financially. Iran did not lose this fight because it lacked creativity. It lost because creativity alone cannot overcome a $500 million hole in your treasury, while the other side is sinking every boat you send out to maintain the threat. That is a lesson other regional actors around the world are quietly absorbing right now, whether they admit it publicly or not. It is a lesson written not in official statements or press briefings, but in sunk boats, drained treasuries, and a negotiating table that Iran did not want to return to this early, on terms it clearly did not choose. Before we get to how this ends, one more thing worth sitting with. It does say, reopened Hormuz is not going to feel like flipping a switch back to normal overnight. Insurance underwriters will want weeks, maybe months, of clean transit data before bringing war risk premiums back down anywhere close to where they were before this began. Shipping companies that rerouted entire fleets around Africa are not going to reverse those decisions instantly either, because repositioning that many vessels back into Gulf trade routes takes real time and real money. So even in the best case scenario, where Oman and Iran finalize their framework soon, and the mine clearing operation wraps up cleanly, you are likely looking at a gradual climb back to full capacity rather than an instant return to the roughly 20 million barrels a day this strait used to carry before any of this started. That is actually the reason oil prices have not already crashed back down despite all this positive momentum. The market is not just pricing in whether a deal gets signed, it is pricing in how long it actually takes for normal shipping behavior to return once that deal becomes real. So where does this leave us right now, today, watching all of this unfold? Keep your eyes on the Oman talks over the coming days, because if that framework actually gets finalized and signed, that will be the true signal that this blockade era is ending, not another promise that a deal is coming tomorrow. Watch the daily vessel numbers coming out of Central Command too. If the number of ships crossing the strait each week starts climbing back towards something resembling normal traffic, that tells you shippers are starting to trust the waterway again, and that trust, backed by real money and real risk calculations from insurance companies, is worth more than any political statement. And keep an eye on the Red Sea. If the Houthis keep escalating there, even as Hormuz calms down, that tells you exactly where Iran's remaining leverage is heading next, and that will be the next chapter of this story worth watching closely. Here is the part I want you to actually sit with before you close this video. A country tried to hold the entire world hostage using the one thing it thought no one could take away: control over a narrow strip of water. And in the span of a few months, that leverage was found, targeted, and dismantled piece by piece, until the same government that once threatened to strangle the global economy is now the one asking for terms. Power in this world does not belong to whoever shouts the loudest threat on state television. It belongs to whoever can actually back that threat up when it matters, and whoever can outlast the other side when the bill comes due. Iran picked a fight over water it could not actually control, and the ocean floor of the Persian Gulf is now littered with the proof of exactly how that gamble ended. If this video actually helped you understand what is happening instead of leaving you more confused, that is exactly why this channel exists. So before you go, do 3 quick things. Subscribe so you do not miss the next update, because with how fast this Oman deal seems to be moving, real news could break within days, like this video, so it reaches more people who are tired of 30-second clips with zero context. And send this to the one person in your life who keeps asking what is actually going on with oil prices in this war. Let me know down in the comments what you think happens next. Does Iran actually sign a real, lasting deal on Hormuz, or is this just a pause before the next round begins? I read every single comment, and I will see you in the next one.